Have you ever witnessed a moment so unexpectedly brutal, so perfectly timed, that the entire room froze for half a second before exploding into uncontrollable laughter? Because that is exactly what happened at the Royal Variety Performance this year, a night meant to celebrate art, music, and entertainment, yet somehow ended up turning into one of the most shocking, unapologetically savage public roastings of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle the royal world has ever seen. And here is the real question. Was this just comedy, or was this a message? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Picture this. The lights dim. The orchestra fades. A spotlight snaps onto the stage. And then, suddenly, the giant screen behind the host flickers, glitches, and displays a massive spinning loading icon. You know the one. The eternal digital purgatory of waiting for something that never seems to happen. The room goes quiet. People lean forward. Some squint at the screen, unsure if this is an error or part of the show. Then the host steps into the light, looks straight into the audience, and in the most casual, almost sympathetic tone says, "Meghan's Hollywood comeback is still buffering. Please be patient. The progress bar is stuck at 2%, right next to her approval rating in Britain." For one full second, the room doesn't know whether to gasp or to burst into laughter. And then, the auditorium detonates. Laughter ricochets off the palace walls. Celebrities clap, others cover their mouths, some shake their heads in disbelief, and the cameras immediately, and intentionally, cut to the future King and Queen of England. Prince William is already smirking. Catherine is trying, and failing, not to laugh. He nudges her, and she gently shoves his shoulder like a wife saying, "Stop it, behave." But her eyes betray her. She's amused. She's entertained. She's loving the moment just as much as the rest of the room. Why did this moment hit so hard? Why did this joke, this single, deadly, perfectly timed punchline, land with nuclear force? And why did William and Catherine react the way they did? Because this wasn't just a joke. This was a pressure valve finally releasing years of tension, drama, accusations, interviews, Netflix specials, podcasts, lawsuits, royal PR crises, and endless headlines involving Harry and Meghan. It was a cultural moment, a symbolic one, a public exhale. But the part no one expected, and the part we're going to unravel, is how deeply this moment actually ran behind the scenes. Because the joke wasn't random, the graphic wasn't a harmless gag, and the reaction wasn't just amusement. This moment had roots. It had context. It had consequences. But let's slow down and paint the scene properly. The Royal Variety Performance 2025 had been billed as one of the grandest in years. The nation was eager for levity. Critics called it a return to traditional British showmanship, a polished, regal, almost nostalgic reminder of unity and entertainment. Celebrities filled the room. Actors, musicians, athletes, philanthropists, ambassadors, and a handful of high-level dignitaries who rarely appeared at these events. And then the royals entered. William and Catherine arrived like a pair straight out of a modern fairy tale, smiling, waving, poised, the picture of charm and confidence. Their presence electrified the room. Cameras flashed relentlessly. People rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. The energy in the air was warm, celebratory. But underneath it all, there was a faint current of something sharp. A hint of tension, a quiet expectation. After years of royal drama swirling around Harry and Meghan, people were wondering, would there be any reference to them tonight? Would anyone dare touch the subject? No one expected what happened next. As the night progressed, dazzling musical acts, comedic skits, breathtaking acrobatic performances, everything felt smooth, polished, risk-free. Until the host came back on stage midway through the second act with a strange grin. The lights dimmed again. The screen behind him lit up with that now infamous spinning loading icon. But here's what most viewers didn't know. That graphic wasn't part of the original rehearsal. It wasn't in the script the royals were sent. It wasn't even part of the host's initial jokes. Something, or someone, made a last-minute change. And it wasn't an accident. But let's stay inside the moment for now. You need to feel what the audience felt. You need to understand the dramatic weight of what followed. As soon as the screen flashed and the host delivered the punchline, the tension that had been quietly building around the royal family's image around public frustration with Harry and Meghan, around the endless PR narratives. It all erupted. People laughed because it was unexpected, because it was daring, because it was clever, because it was the sort of joke everyone had been whispering privately, but no one had dared say publicly. And William and Catherine? Their reaction was instant, honest, human. Catherine's laugh, especially, struck people. For months, she has been under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. Every smile, every appearance, every gesture analyzed. Tonight, though, she allowed herself to laugh. A real laugh, a genuine laugh, the kind that escapes before you can contain it. William saw her shoulders shaking and nudged her. A moment of pure, unscripted humanity, the kind the public doesn't often get from royals. And while millions of viewers at home replayed the clip, joked about it, and shared it online, something far more serious was unfolding behind the scenes. Royal aides exchanged looks. Celebrities in the royal box whispered to each other. Cameras caught the faint smirk on a senior royal's face that will be analyzed for months. Even the orchestra conductor reportedly paused for a beat, stunned, before continuing. You could almost feel the question floating silently through the venue. Is this the moment the monarchy finally stops tiptoeing around the Sussex narrative? Because let's be honest. For years, the royal family has walked on eggshells, maintaining strict silence while Harry and Meghan aired grievances, fired shots, and shaped narratives through Oprah interviews, Netflix series, books, podcasts, and PR campaigns. Tonight, for the first time, the silence cracked. Through comedy, through satire, through the oldest weapon in British entertainment culture, the roast. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To truly understand what this moment meant, why it hit so hard, why it resonated so widely, and why the reaction backstage was even more intense, we have to go deeper into the tension leading up to the event. Because William and Catherine didn't walk into that theater carefree. They entered after a year of brutal headlines, some against them, some against Harry and Meghan, some against the institution itself. There was pressure, there was scrutiny, there was exhaustion, and there was something else. A quiet sense that the public had reached a tipping point. Tonight proved that tipping point had arrived. But the laughter in the auditorium? That was only the beginning. Because as soon as the cameras cut to commercial break, a storm began brewing. People rushed backstage. Phones started buzzing. Messages were sent. Calls were made. Aides scrambled. Producers whispered. Someone even reportedly tried to pull the host aside to ask how in the world that joke made it to the stage. And the answer? Well, that's where this story gets even more unexpected. Because the loading icon joke wasn't random. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't a rogue moment. It had a backstory. A complicated one. A hidden one. One that connects to royal staff, PR strategists, comedy writers, and even someone surprisingly close to Meghan herself. But before we get to that bombshell, we need to go back to the beginning of the night, back to the subtle exchanges and whispered conversations that predicted something was coming, even if no one realized it at the time. And that's where this introduction now leads us. Because what happened next in the theater, the shift in atmosphere, the backstage tension, the private reactions, the confrontation that followed, would change the tone of the entire evening. Have you ever walked into a room where everyone is smiling, yet somehow the air feels tight enough to snap? That's exactly what the energy was like inside the Royal Albert Hall even before the joke that broke the internet. Long before the spinning loading icon flashed behind the host. Long before the audience exploded in laughter. Long before William nudged Catherine with that conspiratorial grin. The tension was already coiling under the velvet seats and gold balconies like a living thing. But why? Why did the room feel charged the moment the royals arrived? Why did people whisper more than usual? Why were the cameras unusually alert, almost hungry? Because everyone, from celebrities in the front rows to the ushers along the aisles, sensed that tonight might not go smoothly. Something was building beneath the polished surface, and the audience felt it instinctively, the way animals sense a storm before the sky breaks. Let's rewind to just 20 minutes before the show started. William and Catherine's car glided to a stop at the front entrance. Paparazzi bulbs burst like tiny fireworks. Their arrival was grand, controlled, regal, but if you watched closely, something was off. William stepped out first, greeting the host line with that familiar warm but neutral smile. Then he glanced back at the car as Catherine stepped out, and for the briefest moment, an expression crossed his face that almost looked like relief. Not joy, not excitement. Relief. As if he'd been bracing for something, or someone. And Catherine? She looked stunning, as always, poised in her gown with that calm, polished grace she is known for. But her eyes, the eyes that reveal what the smile conceals, darted across the crowd with a kind of scanning awareness, as though she was checking for something unexpected, or perhaps checking to confirm that someone wasn't there. Because for the first time in years, rumors had been swirling that Harry and Meghan might attempt to attend, or worse, overshadow, a royal event with some unexpected PR stunt. They didn't show up, of course, but the whisper of the rumor was enough to put everyone on edge. And something else added pressure. Earlier that afternoon, a trending article circulated alleging that Meghan was preparing a surprise industry return announcement, possibly even involving a documentary teaser. Royal aides knew the public was buzzing about it. They also knew the royal variety performance would be the first time that William and Catherine appeared after weeks of speculation about Meghan's supposed Hollywood plans. So yes, the room felt tight. You could sense it in the staffers moving a little too quickly, in the VIP guests whispering a little too closely, in the camera operators adjusting their angles twice instead of once, in the orchestra members exchanging subtle glances before the first note was even played. Everyone felt it. But the real tension? It wasn't in the crowd. It was sitting right next to William and Catherine. A senior royal advisor leaned toward William before the show began, whispering something behind his program. William's face shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest annoyance. Catherine noticed and placed her hand briefly on her husband's arm, a gesture small enough to escape most viewers, but meaningful in the language of long-married couples. It said, "It's fine. Ignore it. Don't let it ruin the night." But something was already brewing. In the opening act, the energy was cheerful but uneven. The performers were flawless, but the audience seemed distracted. People glanced more at the royal box than at the stage. Even the host's early jokes, typically light, harmless pokes at British culture, seemed to fall flatter than usual. Why? Because the crowd wasn't there for comedy. They were there for a moment. A spark. A reaction. A headline. And they got it, but not yet. By the time the second act was preparing to begin, a subtle shift happened. It wasn't the music or the lighting. It wasn't even the entrance of the next performer. It was something harder to pinpoint. Like the building anticipation before a magician's big reveal. The host stepped backstage briefly between segments, and something changed in his demeanor. He'd been joking earlier, loose and playful, but now he looked focused, like someone who'd just been handed a wild card and told, "Use this at your discretion." And here's the detail that almost no one noticed. When he returned to the stage, his eyes flicked immediately toward the royal box. Not the audience, not the performers, not the cameras. Straight to William. A glance so fast you'd miss it if you blinked, but lingering just long enough to say, "You're going to want to see this." William didn't react. At least, not on the surface. But anyone skilled in reading body language, and millions of viewers who later replayed the clip frame by frame, noticed a shift. His posture straightened slightly. His jaw tightened. His hand moved closer to his knee, a subtle priming position. He sensed something was coming. He didn't know what. Not yet, but he knew enough to brace. Meanwhile, Catherine glanced toward the stage with that elegant, composed attentiveness she always wears at public events, but her eyes narrowed just a fraction. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't anxious, but she was alert. And then, the room temperature changed. You could feel it even through the screen. The lights dipped. The murmurs faded. A hush settled over the audience. Not silence, anticipation. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room right before a truth bomb drops. The kind of quiet that feels like a collective inhale. And in that breath, you could almost hear the unspoken question running through the minds of the audience. Is he actually going to go there tonight? And that, right there, is the moment the tension peaked. Because something else had been happening behind the scenes that viewers never saw. An internal disagreement among producers about whether a particular joke should be cut or allowed to stay. Half thought it was too risky. A quarter thought it was too political. And one producer, a junior one, not even the main authority, insisted it absolutely must remain. Why? Because, they argued, the audience needs this. But no one could explain what this was. A release? A jab? A cultural pushback against Harry and Meghan fatigue? Whatever it was, the decision was made. The joke stayed. The loading icon stayed. And the moment the host walked back onto the stage, everyone, from the front row to the balcony, felt that the night was about to shift. And shift it did. But the most important part of this chapter is not the joke. Not yet. It's the tension that made that joke explode with such power. Because a punchline only becomes iconic when the room is ready for it. And on this night, the room wasn't just ready. It was desperate. But what happened when that screen finally lit up? That was the moment that broke the internet, fractured celebrity circles, and sent shockwaves across royal media. But before that massive release of laughter, before the host delivered the line that would echo across social media for days and send commentators scrambling to interpret every syllable, the tension in the room thickened even more. It wasn't visible in the obvious things. Not in the performers, not in the audience applause, not even in the conversations happening in hushed tones between VIP guests. No, the real pressure was building in the subtle details people rarely notice on first viewing. For instance, the camera operators. If you watch the footage closely, you'll see that the operators stationed closest to the royal box were adjusting their angles repeatedly. Not because they were unprepared, but because they knew the production team had instructed them to stay sharp for reaction opportunities. That's a coded instruction in the broadcasting world. It means, stay on the royals. They might give you something. Be ready. And this wasn't standard protocol. Most royal variety performances treat the royal box as a dignified, occasional cutaway, respectful, minimal, decorous. Tonight felt different. The cameramen were hungry, almost expectant. They looked for micro-expressions, lifted eyebrows, exchanged glances, amusement, discomfort, anything that hinted at an emotional ripple. Why? Because everyone sensed that something controversial could happen. And live television feeds off controversy like fire feeds off oxygen. But let's move even closer to the source of the tension. Right before the second act began, about 5 minutes before the joke, William leaned to one of his aides and asked a very simple question. Is everything still on schedule? Harmless words on the surface. But the tone wasn't casual. It was clipped, pointed, controlled. It suggested he wasn't asking about timing. He was asking about surprises. The aide responded quickly, reassuringly, but with that faint tightness in his expression, the kind staff members get when they don't want to admit they aren't fully in control. Catherine looked over briefly, her eyes softening with concern, but also that regal composure she carries everywhere. She placed her hand lightly on William's wrist, grounding him, signaling calm. But here's the important part. The producers backstage were not calm. Minutes earlier, a heated conversation had erupted behind the curtains. One senior producer had discovered the final version of the joke in the host's teleprompter and immediately objected. It's too much, he reportedly said. We can't drag them into this. Not in front of the future king. Another producer disagreed. Oh, please. It's satire. It's harmless. And the audience will love it. A third producer, the youngest on the team, chimed in with surprising confidence. Look at the numbers. Look at the global reaction over the past year. People are exhausted. The joke isn't the problem. The silence is. That remark shifted the conversation. Silence. That word carried weight. Because silence is exactly what the palace has been criticized for. The dignified, tight-lipped, stoic refusal to engage whenever Harry and Meghan unleashed a new wave of accusations in documentaries, memoirs, leaks, podcasts, interviews, or dramatic public statements. And yet here they were, a comedy team about to break that silence with a joke that had been circulating in private circles for months. But I'll come back to the origins of that joke later, because trust me, that part of the story is both unexpected and explosive. Back to the hall. A few audience members, especially those seated near the royal box, noticed that William was not quite as relaxed as he usually is during these events. He clapped politely during the performances, exchanged brief polite smiles with fellow guests, but every now and then, his foot tapped lightly, rhythmically on the floor. That was unusual for him. A subtle sign of internal restlessness. Catherine noticed it. She always does. And she leaned in during a transition between acts to whisper something to him. Something that made him chuckle, just a little. He shook his head as if dismissing whatever concern he'd been holding. But even that tiny laugh felt like it came from a pressure cooker. This wasn't a normal night. Everyone could feel it. And then something small but significant happened. One of the backstage technicians, carrying a headset and clipboard, rushed past the curtains after receiving a message from the sound booth. He glanced at the stage, then at the screen overhead, and his eyes widened slightly, as if realizing the graphic was indeed cued and ready. That graphic, the spinning loading icon, the joke that wasn't supposed to be there, the joke that had just been approved minutes earlier, the joke that could change the mood of the entire evening. The technician hurried to the producer and whispered, "It's still in." The producer hesitated, then sighed, then nodded. A decision had been made. There was no turning back now. On stage, the orchestra wrapped up a brief instrumental interlude, and the host's mic crackled softly as he prepared to step back into the spotlight. But before he did, he made one final decision, one that changed everything. Originally, he had planned to deliver the joke with a more playful tone, lighthearted and comedic. But as he stood behind the curtain and watched the audience, watched the royals, watched the tension simmering, he pivoted. He decided to deliver it deadpan, dry, measured, almost sympathetic, because the cruelest humor is sometimes the quietest. But let's return to the audience. Near the front row sat two A-list actors who had worked closely with Meghan in her previous Hollywood life. When the spinning icon appeared behind the host, they exchanged a confused glance, at first thinking it was a technical error. A comedian sitting a few seats away smirked knowingly. He'd heard rumors about this joke circulating among comedy circles for weeks. A member of the orchestra raised her eyebrows in disbelief when she saw the graphic appear. She'd been at rehearsal earlier and knew it wasn't part of the plan. And then, in the royal box, something subtle yet unmistakable happened. The moment the screen flickered and the loading icon appeared, Catherine's eyes widened just slightly, followed by a quick sideways glance at William. William didn't look shocked. He looked expectant, as if he anticipated something controversial was about to unfold. And that's when it happened. The auditorium dimmed more dramatically. The host walked slowly into the spotlight. He paused. The audience leaned forward. William's posture straightened. Catherine's lips pressed together. The moment before a joke is often more powerful than the joke itself. And this moment stretched out just long enough to feel electric. The host looked at the screen, then at the audience, then back at the screen. And with that calm, devastatingly controlled voice, he said, "Meghan's Hollywood comeback is still buffering." A few gasps, then silence. Pin drop silence. A collective shockwave. Then he added, "Please be patient. The progress bar is stuck at 2%. Right next to her approval rating in Britain." Boom. Detonation. But that explosion? It only mattered because of the build-up, the tension that had been rising before the joke ever reached the microphone. And now the chapter is ready to tilt toward the aftermath. The explosion of laughter that followed the joke didn't just erupt, it rippled, like a shockwave hitting different parts of the room at different speeds. First the front row, where the celebrity guests reacted instantly, some bursting into laughter, others covering their mouths in disbelief. Then the middle rows, where audience members threw their heads back or leaned onto their partner's shoulders. Finally, the upper balconies, where the laughter rolled upward like a tidal wave hitting a cliff face. But the most fascinating reactions weren't the loud ones. It was the silent ones, the micro moments, the flickers of expression that lasted less than a second. Because those tiny moments told the real story. Near the stage, a well-known television presenter froze with her mouth slightly open. The kind of expression people make when they hear a truth they've been holding inside spoken out loud for the first time. She didn't laugh immediately. She blinked. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like relief than amusement. A few seats behind her, a producer from a major streaming platform leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes wide, whispering to his partner. They actually said it. They actually went there. In the royal box, the reaction unfolded like a sequence of slow-motion frames. Frame 1. William's eyes widened just a fraction. That flash of recognition you get when something unexpected hits exactly the nerve you thought it would. Frame 2. His lips twitch upward into a smirk. A restrained smirk, but undeniably real. Frame 3. Catherine's hand freezes halfway through adjusting her dress, her eyes widening. And then, the telltale shoulder shake. The kind of laugh a person tries to hold back, but fails. A genuine, involuntary reaction. Frame 4. William nudges her gently, leaning in with a grin that says, "Are you hearing this?" Frame 5. Catherine covers her mouth, her eyes sparkling with amusement, trying to contain her laughter but absolutely failing to do so. It was human. It was real. It was unscripted. And that made it powerful. But something else happened that very few people caught the first time around. A senior royal aide sitting behind William subtly stiffened. His jaw tightened. His eyes immediately darted toward the backstage curtain as if to signal or warn someone. That reaction wasn't amusement. It was alarm. Because he understood immediately. This joke had crossed into territory the palace had tried to avoid for years. Direct, public ridicule of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Up until this moment, humor targeting Harry and Meghan had mostly been reserved for late-night hosts, American comedians, or anonymous online accounts. But now, this wasn't a random comedian on YouTube or Twitter. This was the royal variety performance. An institution with deep ties to the monarchy, tradition, etiquette, and cultural diplomacy. And the future king and queen had just been caught laughing, whether they meant to or not. Now, let's move backstage, because while the audience laughed, backstage chaos began. The moment the joke landed, the stage manager's headset crackled with overlapping voices. Did they approve that? Who put that graphic in? Is the palace going to call? Cut away from the royals. No, wait. Zoom in. No, hold. Wait, what are we doing? A junior producer, the same one who had argued earlier to keep the joke, stood at the side of the stage with a proud, almost defiant grin. Not smug, but energized. They knew this moment would go viral. They knew it would dominate headlines. They knew the public had been craving a cultural beat shift. But one of the senior producers didn't share that energy. He pulled off his headset, rubbed his forehead, and muttered under his breath. This is going to be a problem. This is absolutely going to be a problem. Meanwhile, a PR representative from the royal household, one who had been sitting politely near the side wing, reached for her phone with trembling fingers. She typed quickly, staring at the stage as if expecting the ceiling to collapse. Her colleagues glanced at her nervously. Did they see it? One whispered. They were laughing, she whispered back. That's not the problem, the colleague replied. The problem is what happens next. Back in the audience, the laughter continued, but it wasn't uniform. Not everyone found the joke funny. A prominent American actress who had once defended Meghan publicly sat stone-faced, arms crossed. She didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She stared directly at the host with a glare sharp enough to cut through steel. A high-profile activist known for advocating against public bullying shook her head in disapproval and whispered, "This is petty. This is cruel." But even she couldn't control the tiny upward curve at the corner of her mouth when the punchline landed. Humor, even when unwelcome, sometimes forces its way through. But the most surprising reaction came from a man seated 3 rows behind the royals, a known Hollywood agent who had previously worked with Meghan before her marriage. He laughed. Hard. Too hard. His partner elbowed him, whispering, "Stop. The cameras are everywhere." But he couldn't help it. He shook with laughter, wiping tears from his eyes. If that isn't symbolic. Now, let's shift the camera back to William and Catherine, because their reaction wasn't just laughter. There was another layer, a deeper meaning between the two of them that most people missed. After Catherine covered her mouth and William nudged her, she turned to him with a look that wasn't just amusement. It was disbelief. A look that said, "Did they really just say that? Here? Tonight?" And William's answering glance absolutely said, "Oh yes, and it's about time." Those two looks between them, that unspoken exchange, carried years' worth of bottled tension. Years of being dragged into narratives they never asked for, stories they never told, accusations they never responded to. This single moment allowed just a sliver of their internal exhaustion to show. But here's where the tension spiked even further. Someone in the audience started clapping. Then another. Then the clapping spread. A standing ovation? Not exactly. But a wave of applause swept across the auditorium. Applause for a roast. You rarely see that at royal events. And you could feel Catherine stiffen briefly, as if unsure how to react to applause directed at a joke about family. William shifted his posture, subtly uncomfortable, as if suddenly aware of the optics. That was the moment the host realized he had ignited something bigger than just laughter. He paused on stage, seeming almost surprised at the reaction, before continuing with the rest of his set, but even he looked slightly shaken by the magnitude of the response. The audience eventually calmed, but the mood had fundamentally changed. The room was alive now, buzzing, crackling, awake, and everyone was waiting for the next move. But here's the most crucial detail of all. Someone in that room pulled out their phone and sent a message directly to Montecito. Not a journalist, not a staffer, not a random guest. Someone very close to Meghan. And the moment Meghan opened that message, everything that followed, backstage, online, in the press, became 100 times more explosive. Because she didn't laugh. She didn't shrug. She didn't ignore it. She reacted. And her reaction? That's where this story goes from dramatic to nuclear. Here's the question everyone asked afterward. The question that shot across social media. The question whispered in private group chats and debated in television studios. Did the host plan this? Because jokes like this don't just happen. Not on royal nights. Not on globally televised stages. Not in front of the future King and Queen of England. Every word is reviewed. Every segment is rehearsed. Every moment is risk-assessed. Royal events run on structure and predictability. Surprises are rare. Jokes are carefully vetted. So how, then, did this joke, this sharp, targeted, unmistakably loaded jab, make it through? Let's rewind to the host's arrival on the day of the show. He walked into the performer's entrance wearing that signature confident swagger he carries everywhere. He's known for his quick wit, his willingness to push boundaries, and his refusal to dilute a punchline just to play it safe. But even someone like him usually toned it down during royal events. It was expected. The moment he stepped into the dressing room, though, the staff noticed something different. He wasn't pacing nervously. He wasn't asking for revisions. He wasn't requesting an extra rehearsal. Instead, he was calm, focused, almost amused. He took a seat in front of the mirror, leaned back, and said, "Tonight's going to be interesting." One of the makeup artists laughed and asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. He just grinned, closed his eyes, and said, "You'll see." Not exactly subtle. 15 minutes later, the head writer entered with the night's script. They went through the jokes, the harmless ones about the weather, British television, the performers, the orchestra, even a light jab at William's well-known competitiveness in sports. All standard, all expected. But there was a blank space on page 6. A gap. A placeholder that simply said, "Joke TBD, optional depending on audience energy." Now, that's normal. Some comedians leave room for improvisation. But something about this one felt deliberate. "Got the final line?" the writer asked. The host smirked. Something like that. He didn't share the joke. He didn't test it. He didn't rehearse it. When the writer asked for specifics, because by protocol, every joke must be reviewed, the host waved it off. "It's clean," he said. "It's light." And then he added something that puzzled the writer. "It's also overdue." Overdue? What does that even mean? But the writer didn't push. After all, the host had delivered the royal variety performance twice before without incident. He knew the rules. He knew the boundaries. Or so they thought. Now here's the twist. When the host met with the producers later that afternoon, he finally revealed the joke, quietly, calmly, casually, as if it were nothing more than a silly throwaway line. The room fell silent. One producer choked on her tea. Another ran a hand down his face, muttering, "No, absolutely not." The youngest producer burst out laughing but then quickly apologized. A fourth stared at the screen and whispered, "Brutal." The senior producer shook his head, closed the script folder, and said, "Not a chance. Not tonight." The host just shrugged. But here's where it gets complicated. The host had received something earlier that morning. A message from a comedian friend in Los Angeles. A screenshot. A meme. A joke that had been circulating quietly in private comedy circles for months. A spinning loading icon with the caption, "Waiting for Meghan Markle's Hollywood comeback." And beneath it, someone had added, "Progress, 2%. Estimated finish time, unknown." Another comedian had replied, "That's about her approval rating in the UK." The host found it hilarious, but not just because of the joke itself. He saw what the meme represented, public exhaustion, and he believed, genuinely believed, that he wasn't punching down, He was punching at a cultural moment. He wasn't attacking Meghan personally. He argued. He was capturing a sentiment people were already expressing. Was he right? Wrong? Overconfident? That depends on who you ask. But what you need to know is this. The joke didn't come from malice. It came from calculation. Because earlier that week, the host had read a long editorial about public trust in institutions, political, cultural, royal, and media. And the concluding line of that editorial was, "We live in an era where people want honesty, not perfection." And in his mind, humor was honesty. Now, back to rehearsal. When the producers expressed their concerns about offending the monarchy, the host said something unexpected. "You're assuming they'll be offended." The room froze. "What do you mean by that?" a producer asked. The host shrugged. "Maybe they need a laugh. Maybe we all do." A younger producer snorted. "And you think roasting Harry and Meghan is the way to do that?" The host didn't miss a beat. "I think everyone is tired of the drama. And sometimes a joke breaks tension better than silence ever could." That line, "better than silence ever could," stuck with the team. It echoed. It lingered. And one producer, the youngest on staff, found themselves agreeing. Because it wasn't a cruel joke. It was commentary. It was satire. It was a reflection of the public mood. And so, after much back and forth, the producers gave him permission to use the joke only if the room felt right. Meaning, if the audience energy was stiff, forced, cold, if the royals seemed tense, if the mood felt too formal, he would drop it. But if the room needed a shock of levity, if the host felt the crowd was craving release, if the atmosphere demanded a moment of honesty, he could deliver it. A conditional joke, a live gamble, a risk with unpredictable consequences. But here's the part no one knew. The host never intended to follow the conditions. He knew he was going to deliver the joke the moment he read it that morning. He didn't decide based on the energy of the room. He didn't decide based on the vibe. He didn't decide based on anything except one thing. He wanted to capture the cultural moment. And he believed, in a way only comedians can believe, that humor is allowed to say what public figures cannot. Now let's talk about tone. Because jokes aren't just words. They're delivery. And the host made a critical decision that afternoon. The decision that made the joke 10 times more impactful. He chose to deliver it completely deadpan. No wink. No smirk. No build-up. No theatrics. Just calm, measured, almost sympathetic honesty. Because he knew that the quieter the delivery, the louder the reaction. People laugh harder when a punchline contrasts sharply with the tone. It feels unexpected. It lands sharper. It hits deeper. And the host understood that perfectly. But here's where the story turns. When the host stepped onto the stage before the second act, the backstage team thought he might not go through with it. They saw him look at the royal box. They saw him glance at the audience. They thought he was assessing the room. He wasn't. He was calculating the camera angles. Because he wanted, intentionally, the cameras to catch William and Catherine's reaction. Not because he wanted to embarrass them, but because he wanted authenticity. He believed they would laugh. He believed they needed to laugh. And he believed the public wanted to see it. And here's something that surprises most people. The host genuinely likes William and Catherine, admires them, finds them relatable, finds them refreshingly human for public figures under immense pressure. He didn't want to harm them. He wanted to give them a moment to breathe. But he also knew something else, something that informed his choice. This joke, if delivered correctly, would not be seen as an attack on the monarchy. It would be seen as a cultural sigh, a release of years of tension. And so, with all that calculation in mind, he walked to the center of the stage. The spotlight hit him. The room quieted. He looked at the screen. He looked at the audience. He took a breath. And he delivered the line exactly the way he planned. Soft, calm, deadly. But the joke itself is only half the story. Because what came next, the reaction backstage, the fallout, the private conversation the host had afterward, revealed the truth behind his intent. And that truth? It's more complicated, more surprising, and more emotionally charged than anyone expected. The moment the joke detonated across the Royal Albert Hall, the host felt something he hadn't felt at a royal variety performance in years. Relief. Not because he'd gotten away with the joke. Not because the audience laughed. Not because the cameras captured the perfect reaction. But because the room, finally, unmistakably, exhaled. It was the kind of reaction only an experienced entertainer understands. A release of pressure. A shared emotional reset. A crowd saying without words, "Thank you. We needed that." But that reaction triggered something else inside him. A reminder. A memory of a conversation he'd had 6 months earlier with a senior British comedian, one who had performed privately for charity events attended by William and Catherine. The comedian told him something that stuck. You can always tell when the royals are pretending to laugh. But when something really hits them, the whole mood shifts. You'll see it one day. Tonight was that day. Because when Catherine tried and failed to suppress her laughter, the host saw something real, a human crack in the polished exterior. A moment of honesty. A moment that transcended the carefully staged rituals of public royal appearances. And that made him even more certain he'd made the right choice. But while the host was riding that wave of instinctive validation, backstage was erupting in a completely different emotional direction. One producer hissed into his headset, "Why did he say it? Why did he say it?" Another snapped back, "Because we let him. We signed off. Don't start blaming him now." The youngest producer, the one who had pushed for the joke, stood with her arms crossed, chin raised, almost defiant. "Look at the audience," she said. "Tell me we made the wrong call." No one answered her, because the audience reaction was undeniable. But the fear backstage wasn't about the audience. It was about the palace. One of the more traditional producers muttered, "We're going to get calls tonight. Serious calls." A crew member nearby, overhearing, whispered, "From who?" "The palace." The producer didn't answer. He didn't have to. But let's move from backstage panic to a much more intimate space. The green room, where performers waited between acts. Because what happened there reveals exactly why the host chose this moment to take the risk. The green room was filled with tension even before the joke. Performers sat scrolling their phones, sipping water, fixing outfits, adjusting microphones. A few exchanged quiet conversations about the royals' arrival, Meghan's rumored Hollywood plans, and the constant churn of royal family-related headlines. But after the joke, the room turned into a hive of whispers. A famous pop singer whispered to her manager, "He didn't actually say that, did he? I thought that meme was fake." A veteran actor muttered, "It was only a matter of time." People are tired. A comedian backstage started laughing so hard he had to sit down, wiping tears from his eyes. "That's the best thing he's ever done," he cackled. Finally, someone said the thing everyone's thinking. But not everyone was amused. A serious-faced theater director shook his head sharply. "This is beneath the royal variety," he snapped. "Cheap humor. Tabloid humor. This lowers the tone." His assistant whispered, "The audience loved it." "That's the problem," the director replied. "They're laughing at pain." But that's where he was wrong, at least from the host's perspective. Because the host never meant it as cruelty. He meant it as commentary. A mirror held up to public sentiment. A way to break tension through humor, not inflict harm. But not everyone saw it that way. And Meghan, watching from afar, or more accurately, reading the message someone sent within 60 seconds, definitely didn't see it that way. But we'll get to her reaction soon. For now, we need to explore the host's mindset in those critical minutes after the joke landed. Because as he continued his set, he kept glancing, not at the audience, not at the cameras, but at the royal box. He wanted to read William. He wanted to read Catherine. He needed to know if he'd stepped too far. When he saw Catherine's eyes sparkling with laughter, something inside him softened. When he saw William smirk and shake his head, something inside him steadied. But then he caught the royal aide's reaction. The stiff posture, the pursed lips, the sideways glance toward backstage. The host felt a tiny jolt of realization. This was not going to blow over quietly. Not tonight. But before we dive deeper into consequences, this chapter needs to explore the origin of the joke itself. Because understanding where it came from is the key to understanding the host's true intent. It didn't start with the meme. It started months earlier at a private industry event, a small dinner for comedy writers, producers, and performers. The host attended with a few well-known figures in British comedy. And at this dinner, after a few drinks loosened the mood, someone asked the question that no one says out loud in official settings. Are we allowed to joke about Harry and Meghan yet? Most people laughed, nervously. Someone muttered, "You can, but you'll get canceled." Another joked, "Only if you want your phone blowing up with angry messages." But then a senior comedian, respected, iconic, almost untouchable, leaned back in his chair and said, "One day, someone will make the first big joke. And when it happens, the whole dam will break. Public sentiment has already shifted. People are tired of the circus. That sentence stuck with the host. It stuck because it wasn't said out of malice. It was said out of observation, out of fatigue, out of truth. And then the comedian added something else, something even more pointed. The royals won't say anything. They can't. But comedians can. That line became the spark. Over the months that followed, the host quietly tested the waters. He slipped small references into smaller gigs, subtle, harmless quips about drama, about interviews, about small details. Nothing harsh, nothing personal. And he noticed something. The audience laughed harder than expected, not because the jokes were sharp, but because they were relieved. Relieved to see someone break the tension. Relieved to laugh about something that had felt too heavy, too dramatic, too emotionally charged to touch. And so by the time the royal variety performance approached, the host didn't feel nervous. He felt ready, not to attack, not to humiliate, but to acknowledge, through humor, something the public had been feeling for a long time. But here's where the story flips unexpectedly. The host wasn't the only one who felt this way. A surprising number of people involved in the event, producers, crew members, performers, believed that the joke wasn't just permissible, but necessary. And one of them had ties to Meghan's inner circle. And this is where the Real story begins to twist. Because the joke's approval wasn't entirely internal. Someone outside the comedic team influenced it. Someone familiar with Meghan. Someone who had their own reasons for letting the joke through. To understand the full weight of what happened that night, you need to know the identity of the person who quietly, almost stealthily, nudged the joke into the final script. Because while the host may have delivered it, while producers debated it, while writers tried to soften it, one voice tipped the balance. And that voice belonged to someone who once worked very closely with Meghan Markle. Not a friend, not a hater, not a royal insider. A former PR consultant. Yes, someone who dealt with Meghan's public image directly during the early days of her transition into royal life. Someone who watched the public sentiment shift. Someone who lived through the Oprah interview fallout, the Netflix contract hype, the Spotify collapse, the memoir whirlwind, and the endless media cycles. And this consultant wasn't vindictive. They weren't out to get Meghan. They weren't trying to embarrass her. They were trying to send a message. A message Meghan had ignored for years. A message Harry had brushed off. A message industry insiders had whispered politely, but never said out loud. The message was simple. You've lost the room. That's why, during the production meeting, when the senior producer expressed hesitation about approving the joke, this consultant stepped forward and said something that changed the direction of the entire conversation. You are overestimating the backlash and underestimating the fatigue. Those words landed hard. The room went quiet. Producers exchanged looks. The host stared at the consultant for a long moment, reading them, assessing them. Explain, the host said. The consultant leaned forward. People aren't angry at Meghan anymore. They're tired. They're exhausted. They're done. The drama has overstayed its welcome. And when public exhaustion hits, humor becomes the release valve. This joke isn't cruelty. It's punctuation. A full stop. And if anyone understood punctuation, it was the host. But the consultant wasn't done. Also, they added, the royal family can't respond. They won't respond. They will sit through it, smile politely, and let the moment pass. But the audience? They'll understand. They're already there. The youngest producer nodded eagerly. The host smirked. But the senior producer pushed back. What if Meghan takes this personally? What if she fires back publicly? The press will tear us apart. The consultant shook their head. She can't fire back. Not without proving the joke true. That she's sensitive to even the slightest critique. Her brand is built on resilience, empowerment, reinvention. If she reacts emotionally, she loses the narrative. So she won't. She'll say nothing. The host raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about that? The consultant smiled, a sad, knowing smile. No, but I know how she thinks. She might rage privately, but publicly? No. She can't afford to look brittle. This analysis, coming from someone who had worked directly with Meghan's prior PR teams, carried weight. Heavy weight. And it was that perspective, not the host's ego, not the audience's anticipation, that ultimately tipped the scale. The joke stayed. And so, hours later, While the host stood under those blinding stage lights with thousands watching in person and millions watching from home, he wasn't just telling a joke. He was executing a calculation. A cultural read. A moment that had been building for years. But let's move back to the host's perspective in real time, because the moment he delivered the punchline, something unexpected happened inside him. He felt a jolt of adrenaline, not from nerves, but from recognition. He recognized that the audience wasn't laughing because the joke was harsh. They laughed because it was accurate, painfully accurate, culturally accurate. And that's when the host knew the real truth. This wasn't a joke about Meghan. This was a joke about public fatigue. This was a joke about overexposure, about constant drama, about the way the world had been force-fed narratives and counter-narratives until their appetite for sympathy evaporated. And the host wasn't the only one who recognized it. As the laughter continued, a whisper flowed through the audience like a wave, not spoken out loud, not verbalized in words, but felt. A shift, a turning. The kind of cultural moment that begins subtly and then suddenly becomes undeniable. And the host, watching from the stage, saw the shift in real time. He saw the relief. He saw the release. He saw the sense of finally. But while the audience was laughing, something completely different was happening in the royal box. Catherine's laughter was pure, a real, human moment breaking through the formality. But immediately after the initial laugh, a subtle awareness crossed her face. Her spine straightened. Her features composed themselves. She glanced toward the cameras. She realized instantly that this moment would be replayed endlessly. William noticed her shift. He adjusted, too. His smirk softened into a neutral expression, diplomatic, practiced. But the damage, or impact, was already done. The cameras had captured everything. And the host saw that, too. Because as an entertainer, he knows the difference between a joke that lands and a joke that detonates. And this one? It was a detonation. But here's where things shift even more dramatically. Once the laughter began fading, the host scanned the room for one specific reaction, one he suspected might be there, but wasn't sure. A reaction of hurt, of offense, of shock. And he found it. Near the left aisle, halfway up the seating, sat a well-known British journalist with close ties to Montecito. Someone who had publicly defended Meghan numerous times. Someone who had praised her podcast, her interviews, her activism. Someone who had built an entire online persona around supporting the Duchess. This journalist was not laughing, not smiling, not amused. Their mouth was a hard line. Their eyes were narrowed. Their arms were crossed. The host knew instantly. There would be an article tomorrow, a column, a think piece. And that was fine, because he also knew something else, something that shaped how he felt during that moment. Tonight wasn't a battle. It wasn't a hit piece. It wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. And honesty always comes with a price. But the host wasn't afraid of that price. Because behind the scenes, and this is where the story takes an unexpected emotional turn, he had his own personal reason for delivering that joke. A reason rooted not in Meghan herself, but in something that happened years earlier involving Harry. A reason the public doesn't know. A reason tied to a private event, a brief exchange, and a comment that had stuck with him for years. An encounter that made him reconsider Harry not as a prince, but as a man, a complicated, pressured, frustrated man. An encounter that made the host believe, deep down, that humor was not an attack, but a chance at a reset. And that encounter, that moment, is what we're going to unravel next. Because once you understand what happened between the host and Harry years ago, the host's true intent becomes unmistakable and far more emotional than anyone realized. To understand the host's true intent, the emotional core beneath the joke, the reason he chose this stage and this moment, you need to know what happened 3 years earlier at a private charity gala. A night no cameras recorded. A night almost no one speaks about publicly. A night involving Harry, long before the Oprah interview, long before Spare, long before the global backlash. The host had been invited to perform a short routine for a closed-door fundraiser. Royals often attended such private functions. Donors expected entertainment. Performers expected polite applause. Nothing controversial. Nothing political. Nothing personal. That was the unspoken rule. But before the host went on stage, something unexpected happened. He ran into Harry backstage. Not the Harry of television interviews. Not the Harry of podcasts or memoirs. Not the angry, wounded, outspoken version the world knows now. This was a quieter Harry. A tired Harry. A Harry who looked like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't put down. Harry approached him first. "You're performing tonight, yeah?" he said. The host nodded. Harry offered a tight smile. "Do me a favor," he said softly. The host raised an eyebrow. "Sure. What's up?" Harry looked almost embarrassed. "Keep the jokes light. No family stuff." It wasn't rude. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't entitled. It was a plea. Not because he was sensitive, but because he seemed terrified of something spiraling. Terrified of a comment landing wrong. Terrified of tension erupting between him and the other royals in the room. The host, taken aback by Harry's vulnerability, nodded gently. "Of course. I wasn't planning to anyway." Harry exhaled deeply. "Thank you," he said. "You don't know how much I appreciate that." Then he walked away. The host watched him go, struck by the interaction. It wasn't what he expected from a prince. There was no arrogance, no entitlement, just a man struggling under the weight of a world he couldn't control. And that moment stayed with him. So when the world turned upside down, when Meghan entered the picture, when the split happened, when interviews were released, when accusations were made, when the couple stepped back, stepped forward, stepped onto global stages, the host kept remembering that moment. The moment when Harry asked him, quietly, gently, not to make jokes about family. Not because he couldn't take it, but because he didn't want to add fuel to a fire he couldn't put out. That memory never left the host. So why, then, did he deliver this joke? Because over time, something became clear to him. The fire Harry tried so desperately to avoid became the fire Harry later chose to fan. The host watched the Oprah interview, the accusations, the Netflix documentary, the memoir, the podcast, the endless headlines, the public unraveling. The host watched not with anger, but with disappointment. Not because Harry spoke out, but because the man who once said, "No family jokes, please," had become the man making the jokes himself. The jabs, the stories, the one-liners that undermined the very institution he once begged people to shield. The host's perspective changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, gradually, painfully. He no longer saw Harry as the man trying to protect his family. He saw him as the man trying to weaponize his story against his family. And that shift became the emotional undercurrent that shaped the joke. This wasn't revenge, not anger, not cruelty. It was disappointment. It was the host saying, through humor, "You weren't supposed to become this." But again, it's important to understand, the host didn't hate Harry. He didn't hate Meghan. He didn't hate anyone involved. He was simply reacting to the story the world had been fed, relentlessly, unavoidably, for years. And he believed the public felt the same way. But let's not stay in the emotional complexity too long, because something else happened backstage that night, which sealed the joke's place in history. Right after delivering the punchline, the host walked behind the curtain for a brief transition. And as he stepped into the backstage area, someone was waiting for him. The consultant. The one who had worked with Meghan's team. The one who gave the joke their blessing. The one who predicted exactly how the public would react. They stood there with arms crossed, watching him closely. "Well?" the host asked. "Too much." The consultant shook their head. "No," they said softly. "You read the moment perfectly." But the consultant's face shifted, not angry, not upset, but thoughtful, concerned. The host raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong?" The consultant stepped closer. "You've opened a door tonight," they whispered. "A big one. Bigger than you realize." The host frowned. "What kind of door?" The consultant looked toward the royal box, where William and Catherine were still visible from backstage. "A door the monarchy won't close again." The meaning hung in the air. A shift, a cultural pivot, a crack in the silence that could never be reversed. And the host understood. He didn't just deliver a joke. He delivered a moment. One that would outlive the performance. One that would ignite